Honorable Ministers, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I welcome you to our 30th meeting of Rjmec. It is our fourth meeting in 24 months of extended transition period. We are now only 17 months to elections scheduled for December 2024. To date, critical milestones as set out in the revitalized peace agreement have not been accomplished in accordance with the timelines of the roadmap. In my recent engagements, both within the region and at the international level, it is clear that there is growing concern regarding the slow pace of implementation of the agreement in view of the timeline set in the roadmap. There is therefore need for concerted efforts to fast-track its implementation. My statement this morning will highlight the recent Rjmec engagements with the parties, other South Sudanese stakeholders, regional leaders, and the international community. I will then provide updates on the progress made since our last meeting and conclude with observations and recommendations. Since our last meeting, I had the opportunity to meet His Excellency Salva Kiir Mayardit, President of the Republic of South Sudan, where I briefed him on Rjmec's assessment of the status of the implementation of the agreement, as well as concerns over the slow pace of implementation of critical tasks required for the conduct of credible elections by the end of the transition period, namely the redeployment of the necessary unified forces, reconstitution of the National Constitutional Review Commission, and preparation for the conduct of elections. His Excellency the President acknowledged Rjmec's concerns, recounted the RTNew's ongoing efforts to expedite implementation, and assured Rjmec of his government's commitment to complete implementation of the critical pending tasks and to hold elections as scheduled. I also met with His Excellency Dr. Rjmec Vice President of the Republic of South Sudan, and discussed with him a wide range of issues about the implementation of the RACRIS, including the delay by the RTNew to complete critical tasks as per the roadmap. His Excellency the Vice President reiterated his commitment to implementation of the RACRIS to the letter and spirit in order to have credible elections. Rjmec attended the 14th ordinary session of IGAD Assembly of Heads of State and Government, which was held in Djibouti on the 12th of June 2023, which, among others, deliberated on the crisis in neighboring Sudan and the peace process in South Sudan. Regarding the South Sudan peace process in particular, the summit, in its communique, among others, took note of the RTNew's commitment to hold elections in December 2024 and urged the government to expedite implementation of key tasks critical for the conduct of elections. On 20th June 2023, I briefed the United Nations Security Council session in New York on the Rjmec's assessment of the status of the implementation of the RACRIS and our role in support of the peace implementation. In the briefing, I appealed for international support to the peace process, including direct funding for some of the critical upcoming processes of the permanent constitution-making, election preparations, and the disarmament, mobilization, and reintegration (DDR) programs. The Security Council members urged the parties in South Sudan to work collectively to honor their commitments in the RACRIS and expressed their backing for strengthening 35% quota of women as outlined in the RACRIS. However, they voiced concerns over the slow progress in implementing the RACRIS and failure to meet the agreed targets. I also held separate meetings with the permanent representatives of the IGAD member states, the AU C5, and the UN Security Council A3. I briefed them on the implementation of the RACRIS and appealed for support to the South Sudan peace process. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, in terms of the status of the implementation of the agreement, I will now highlight key observations under each chapter of the agreement. In terms of the status of the implementation of the agreement, under governance, the Judicial Reforms Committee, JRC, has so far held stakeholders' consultations in Western Bargasel, Western Equatoria, and Upper Nile states, as well as the Greater Bipolar Administrative Area. Perspectives from these stakeholders will be critical in informing the JRC's recommendations to the RTIGNU on the judicial reforms. In terms of legislative reforms, on the 5th of June 2023, the National Election Act Amendment Bill 2023 and the Anti-Corruption Commission Act Amendment Bill 2023 were tabled before the reconstituent Transitional National Legislature for consideration and enactment. I encourage the TNL to expedite this process and enact these laws. Regarding the National Constitution Amendment Committee, NCSC, the RTIGNU has extended its mandate for another 4 months to enable the committee to complete its pending tasks, namely to draft and complete amendments to the NGO, the investment promotion, the mining, the transport, the pension fund, and the Telecommunications Acts. The delayed reconstitution of the Political Parties Council and other independent institutions and commissions at the national level continues to impede progress on the implementation of this chapter of the agreement. On the permanent ceasefire and transition security arrangements, the permanent ceasefire is still holding, which is a commendable achievement under Chapter 2. This notwithstanding, CITSAM-VM reported alleged clashes between SPLO-IO forces and some defectors in Mayut County of Upper Nile State. In Central Equatorial State, CITSAM-VM reported increased National Salvation Army NAS attacks on both civilians and the SSPDF. There are also clashes allegedly between the SPLM-IO Protection Force from Panyikang County, Upper Nile State, and an SSPDF protection unit from Rjmec administrative area, which led to injury and loss of life. I would like to hear more from the JDB and CITSAM-VM regarding these alleged clashes. On the unification of forces, there is no new progress to report regarding the redeployment of Phase 1 necessary unified forces, nor the commencement of Phase 2 NUF training. I would like to hear an update from the RTIGNU and the JDB on these pending tasks. Regarding CITSAM-VM's operational and administrative challenges, as reported in the last plenary, I have held several consultations with the concerned parties, the CITSAM-VM leadership and the executive secretary of the IGAD to resolve the issues raised. Consequently, IGAD has reviewed and endorsed the terms of reference of the CITSAM-VM chairperson and the CITSAM-VM board. In addition, it has given guidance on the draft terms of reference of the CITSAM-VM Technical Committee, CTC. CITSAM-VM leadership is therefore expected to brief the board on these outcomes and to present the draft CTC terms of reference for endorsement. I would like to commend the SSPDF leadership efforts in inculcating discipline and holding the forces accountable, as evidenced by its recent general court-martials, which tried the 2 cases in Yei, Central Equatorial State. The accused soldiers and junior officers faced offenses ranging from murder to sexual and gender-based violence. Sentences added down included imprisonment, dismissal, reduction in rank, fines, and compensation to the victims. It is encouraging that all other forces institutionalize accountability measures and take steps to prevent recurrence of such crimes, especially gender-based violence, and for rehabilitation of victims. On police reforms, efforts are being made to reform the National Police Service, as outlined in the National Police Strategic Plan 2020-2024. In this regard, Rjmec welcomes the ongoing focus on preventing and investigating sexual and gender-based violence, including by strengthening the police capabilities in identifying and investigating gender-based violence cases. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, in terms of humanitarian affairs, the onset of rains and the influx of refugees and returnees from Sudan continue to exacerbate the already severe humanitarian needs in the country. However, it is concerning that there is growing population of returnees who are stranded in Rjmec, Upper Nile State, where conditions are deteriorating. I appeal to Artignew and the international community to mobilize additional support for the resettlement of the returnees. On resource, economic, and finance management, it is noted that there is progress in the budget process. However, there is need for Artignew to fulfill its budgetary commitments of funding agreement institutions which have continued to face recurrent financial challenges. In this regard, the Artignew is urged to create fiscal space needed to implement the RRCs. Further, the Artignew is urged to ensure the establishment of effective public procurement and payroll systems and grant public service concessions, public borrowing, and debt management to facilitate transparency and accountability in the public sector as per Article 4.12.1 of the RRCs. The importance of the private sector as an engine of economic growth cannot be overemphasized, especially in transition economies. It is therefore recommended that the establishment of the Enterprise Development Funds be prioritized in order to improve productivity and to provide the domestic private sector's access to finance. In this regard, it is concerning that the legal framework for the Youth Enterprise Development Fund and the Women Enterprise Development Fund remains outstanding. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, on transition justice, the drafting of the Commission of Truth, Reconciliation and Healing and the Compensation and Reparation Authority bills are in progress. It is understood that the two bills have been substantially reviewed based on expert views arising from the recent Transition Justice Conference and public consultations. I urge the Artignew to expedite completion of the two bills. Regarding the making of the permanent constitution, there is no further progress to report. The National Constitution Review Commission, NCRC, is yet to be reconstituted, and the other mechanisms like Constitution Drafting Committee, CDC, and the Preparatory Subcommittee, PSC, for the National Constitution Conference have not yet been established as required by the Constitution Making Process Act. However, I am informed that the stakeholders have all submitted their lists of nominated representatives to reconstitute the National Constitution Review Commission and establish the Preparatory Subcommittee. The parties have agreed on the allocation of membership within the NCRC and PSC. I urge the parties to submit the list of their nominees in order to hasten the reconstitution of the NCRC and the establishment of the PSC. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, overall, it is important to reiterate that in order to conduct free, fair, and credible elections as scheduled, there is need to achieve the following benchmarks in the RRCs. A, reconstitution and operationalization of the institutions tasked with the preparation and conduct of elections, namely the Political Parties Council and the National Elections Commission. B, judicial reforms to enhance the capacity and independence of the judicial institutions to deal with election-related disputes. C, completion of the unification and redeployment of forces in order to provide security throughout the election process. D, the making of the permanent constitution under whose provisions elections shall be conducted. And E, improvement to the overall political and civic space to enhance public participation in the constitution-making and electoral process. In view of the aforementioned, it is important to underscore the need to deliberately hasten the pace of implementation of the agreement. I would like, therefore, to make the following recommendations to Artignew. A, provide adequate and predictable funding for the implementation of the all critical pending tasks of the agreement. B, continue to consult and dialogue in the spirit of collegial cooperation and consensus to address emerging issues during the implementation of the agreement. C, prioritize efforts aimed at promoting peace, reconciliation, and healing at national and community level. D, prioritize the implementation of social service provisions as outlined in the Budget Appropriation Bill of 2023-2024 in order to reduce economic vulnerability of ordinary citizens. And E, provide immediate support to returnees to enable them resettle and reintegrate in their communities or places of choice in safety and dignity. In conclusion, Your Excellencies, as South Sudan marks its 12th independence anniversary, I would like to congratulate the people and government of South Sudan on this milestone, and more importantly, on sustaining the peace efforts over the last 5 years since the signing of the revitalized peace agreement in 2018. South Sudan should seize this opportunity to consolidate the peace dividends and implement the critical tasks in the roadmap so as to fulfill the aspirations of our people for justice, equality, respect for human rights, and the rule of law. I thank you.
I also want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, for literally reporting everything we're supposed to report, chapter by chapter. So I will just reiterate issues that maybe have not been reported in the past report. And I would like to be brief in that I will start with Article 119 of the agreement regarding the restructuring and reconstitution of the commissions and independent institutions that are important for the conduct of elections. In this regard, I want to say that the parties to the agreement has allocated to themselves the 17 commissions that are outlined in the agreement. Out of the 17, there are 4 which are pending enactment of the legislation for their establishment. And in that regard, the key commissions that are critical for the conduct of elections will be the NRC, the National Constitutional Review Commission. Under the National Constitutional Review Commission, we have received a draft budget for the commissions to operate. We have also sent a message to all the parties to submit the list of their representatives to this commission. Last Thursday, 2 parties, the ITGONU and the IO, was still work in progress to give us the list of the nominees. We are supposed to have a meeting today in order to receive the nominees of the other parties. I think we have received the nominees for OPP and for SOA. We are now awaiting ITGONU and IO. And that will then conclude, once appointed by the President, it conclude the enactment and establishment of the National Constitutional Review Commission. Under this item, we have also agreed with the UNMISS and other UN agencies and partners on how to proceed with the electoral and constitutional making process. We have also looked at the Political Parties Council. The bill is out, it has guided us, and last week we met. Unfortunately, the IO was not in attendance. They were still working on the nominees for the other commissions. So this afternoon, we're supposed to meet and agree on how to conclude on the establishment of the Political Parties Council. The bill is clear. The bill provides that the chair, the deputy chair, will be appointed by the executive, that means the presidency, and it sets out representation of the political parties as well as stakeholders. So we are supposed to hold a meeting this week with all the stakeholders, civil society organizations, the faith-based organizations, the academia, in order to now give us the list of their nominees. Unfortunately, we were interrupted this week, but I can assure you that early next week, we will hold a meeting of the parties, including the stakeholders, in order to nominate representatives to the Political Party Council. This is a body that is non-partisan. It is not subject to political allocation. So we should be straightforward in dealing with it. The other important commission with regard to election is the National Election Commission. We have now again received the budget for it. This is one of the commission which the parties to the agreement are now considering nominees to represent them in this commission. So I expect that early next week we have all the nominees of the parties to the agreement, and we should be able to constitute that commission. In terms of criticality of the commissions in the process of election, I think these are the three important commissions: the National Constitutional Review Commission, the National Election Commission, and the Political Parties Council. These, I think, are the most critical. The other commissions are important as they are, but they are also being reconstituted. Mr. Chair, I think you outlined the status of the bills for the Commission of Truth, Reconciliation and Healing, as well as the Compensation and Protection Authority. You recall that we held a workshop from the 15th to the 17th of last month, and indeed the task force, which is in the Ministry of Justice and Constitutional Affairs, is enriching the draft bill with the views and experiences gained during this workshop. So I expect also that these two bills should be available anytime from next month. I would like to say that the constitutional making process is clearly defined in the bill, and there shouldn't be any misunderstanding of introductions that are not there. I'm told some people have drafted their own draft bill, law or constitution, but I want to say that the drafting of the constitution is the matter of the Republic of South Sudan. We will not accept any other bill, any other draft from anywhere else. On the conclusion on the organization of the second Echelon, I would leave it to my friend, the Secretary of the NTC, to update us, or the JDB representatives behind to update us. Yeah, I mentioned this before. My colleague is just reminding me to say that one of the delays in the establishment commission was the sharing of the position of executive director. But all of us, as parties to the agreement, have agreed that we will not confuse civil servant positions, such as executive directors, to be allocated politically. So we are only sharing the chair and the deputy chair, and not the executive directors. This applies to all the commissions. And I think it was the matter that delayed us to reach a consensus on this matter. Otherwise, Honorable Chair, I'm glad that you know the TNLA is going ahead with ratification of bills. You also know that the JDB is progressing with the establishment of the second Echelon of the security sector, and that the issue of appointment of the Minister of the Interior and Minister of Defense is a matter of the Presidency to resolve.
For those who are new in this August forum of the Rjmec plenary meeting, the National Transitional Committee is pleased to present progress made and challenges faced while working to discharge its mandate of coordinating the implementation of transitional security arrangements, remaining critical task. Our mandate is to implement the Chapter 2 provision that have not been implemented during the pre-transitional period. So our role is that of coordination based on TRO, the term of reference. This report focuses on coordination, facilitation, and achievement made seen at the 29th of Rjmec's monthly plenary meeting. That means seen the last meeting of Rjmec. The NTC continues to work on securing funding for security mechanism, operating costs, and release of approved emergency food item for the graduated unified forces who are stranded at various training centers to pave the way for the commencement of phase 2. Unfortunately, the funds have not been released until today. That's one. 2, coordination and facilitation of activities. The NTC coordinated and facilitated the following security arrangements activities for the month of July 2023. Bullet 1, NTC facilitated meeting of security mechanism on unification of lower and middle echelons. So far, the outstanding issues have been referred to the principals to resolve them. Bullet 2, pursuant to the Council of Ministers Resolution number 10, 2023, we submitted a request on May 29 to release the approved amount of 3.6 million billion SSP to the Ministry of Finance and Planning for payment to cover the costs of assorted food items for the deployment of the graduated unified force. The Ministry of Finance and Planning is yet to release that amount requested. Bullet 3, on page 3, the NTC is still following up with the Ministry of Finance and Planning to release the fund to cover the transportation of the military uniform and other equipment in the Fort Mombasa, Kenya, cognizant that the uniforms and other equipment were donated by the Republic of Turkey for the graduated unified forces. The NTC is yet to receive the money from the Ministry of Finance and Planning. The uniforms and other equipment are still in Fort Mombasa. Number 3, funding. On 28 March 2023, the NCTC submitted a request for amount of 2.5 billion to the Ministry of Finance and Planning for the operating cost of security mechanism. That amount has not yet been released until today. The Artigono allocated 50 billion SSP for peace implementation in its budget for the 2023-2024 fiscal year. But 4 challenges. Lack of funding remains to be a serious challenge facing NTC to implement the security arrangement activities. Excuse me. The ex-combatant under the DDR and the graduate unified forces are still occupying training centers due to lack of facilities outside the training centers. Lack of assorted food items for the forces in training centers, cantonment sites. Page 4, the recommendation. The NTC urged the RRK's principle to resolve the stalemate over low and middle echelons of the command structures so that other institutions take up their responsibilities. Bullet number 2, expedite the deployment of forces and immediate commencement of phase 2, the training centers. Bullet 3, the NTC appealed to Friends of South Sudan, the RRK's guarantors, African Union and the UN to help support the NTC to fully implement the transitional security arrangement remaining tasks. 4, the Ministry of Finance and Planning is requested to release funds earmarked for security mechanism, operating costs, and emergency food items. Finally, 6, on the same page 4, observation. The graduation of the forces brought about renewed hope and confidence on the peace process among the people of South Sudan. That spirit ought to be maintained to move the country forward. Number 2, the hardships caused by non-deployment of the unified forces has created social distress, uncertainty, and prostration among the unified graduated forces and the people of South Sudan. Therefore, it is imperative that the funds are urgently provided to expedite the deployment of those graduated unified forces and completion of the key tasks of Chapter 2 which is in bracket the implementation of transition security arrangement activities. Thank you.
I thank Rjmec for another opportunity to brief you again today. Since our last meeting, both you and I have briefed the United Nations Security Council on the political and security developments over the last 3 months. I had highlighted that the conflict in Sudan continues to affect the political, humanitarian, security and economic situation in South Sudan. I commended the positive role South Sudan continues to make in welcoming returnees and refugees with or without documentation, as well as the constructive efforts of IGAD and South Sudan in the Sudanese mediation process. Finally, I cautioned against taking our eyes off the ball on South Sudan's peace process. I acknowledge efforts made through the recently tabled draft national budget for 23-24, which allocates about 50 billion South Sudanese pounds to peace implementation. However, a sense of urgency is required to move forward, especially to provide these resources to the mechanisms of the agreement, which would allow for the implementation of critical tasks. I welcome the establishment of the Joint Task Force for the implementation of constitution-making and electoral processes, which held its inaugural meeting on 1 June. Subsequently, working-level meetings have been held on the 6th and 15th of June, and discussions on a draft national elections budget are ongoing. The Joint Task Force must be used as a forum to help accelerate implementation of the roadmap. Relatedly, UNMISS and UNDP have supported the Parliamentary Committee on Legislation and Justice in a 2-day consultation with civil society actors on the affirmative action provisions of the National Elections Act. I believe that the ground is now primed for a speedy deliberation and submission of recommendations to Parliament so as to enable the passage of the Act. Let me commend the African Union Mission in South Sudan for convening the inaugural principals meeting of the Special Reconstruction Fund, which is essential for the program for reconstruction and infrastructure development as envisaged under Chapter 3 of the agreement. The next step is for the transitional government to form the board to pave the way for the UN, AU and IGAD to commence arrangements for the South Sudan Pledging Conference. Excellencies, time is of the essence as key components of the transitional security arrangements remain behind schedule. It is critical for the parties to resolve the appointments of what we call the middle echelon of the command structures so that the first batch of the necessary unified forces can be deployed and phase 2 of the transitional security arrangements can commence. After 3 months, there have been divergent views on whether the deadlock that emerged as a result of the removal of the defense and interior ministers and the subsequent swapping of the same portfolios has been resolved. But we encourage the presidency and the parties to address the remaining sticking points. A conducive political and security environment is non-negotiable given we are in the penultimate lap of implementing free, fair and credible elections. In my engagements in New York, I shared the frank views expressed by some government officials, political parties, civil society, and many of you here in this plenary, that South Sudan today is not yet ready at this point to roll out free, fair and credible elections. South Sudan can, however, make significant strides towards this December 2024 target with political will, adequate resourcing and a commitment to create an appropriate political environment. In this regard, I echo the call made by IGAD last month, urging the national legislature to expedite the reconstitution of the National Elections Commission and the Political Parties Council. Excellencies, the ongoing conflict in Sudan continues to drive thousands of people across the borders into South Sudan, seeking refuge and safety. As people arrive, transit, and move to their destinations of choice, increased competition amongst communities and congested sites over scarce resources has exacerbated existing tensions, as we witnessed in Rjmec. The situation in and around Malakal remains volatile following the intercommunal clashes at the protection of civilian site on 8th of June. Recent claims of mobilization in Upper Nile State threaten the vulnerable communities at the POC site and in the town, and the mission has appealed to all parties to exercise maximum restraint. And we ourselves have deployed additional peacekeepers to strengthen security in and around the POC site. I'd like to acknowledge the effective coordination and cooperation with the Governor of Upper Nile, the South Sudan People's Defence Forces, the South Sudan National Police Service and National Security Service in restoring calm and maintaining security. The mission will continue to actively monitor the situation with the expectation that tensions are likely to rise due to continuing congestion and competition for scarce resources. Humanitarians continue to support the vulnerable populations, even with the additional strain on the humanitarian resources of the UN and other agencies and partners and the international community generally. As of 3rd of July, the midpoint of the year, only 35% of the 2023 humanitarian response plan has been funded, despite the increasing needs from refugees and returnees spawned by the Sudan war. To conclude, I wish to share that as the 12th anniversary of the South Sudanese independence approaches, my assessment from interactions with regional and international partners here and outside suggests the need to deepen mutual trust and to build common purpose. I believe there may be more international willingness to support the peace process, even further if there are demonstrable forward steps and the right frameworks to allow for assistance. Key decisions about electoral, constitutional, and security structures must be made urgently, and these decisions do not require additional resources in order to be made. I assure the parties at the United Nations family remain committed to supporting and working with other regional and international partners for peace and stability. I thank you.